One of the biggest misconceptions people have after a relationship with a narcissist ends is believing that silence automatically means healing. When both people stop reaching out, stop texting, stop calling, and stop checking in, it can appear from the outside that both individuals are moving on in the same way. It can look balanced, it can look mutual, it can even look healthy. But what many people eventually discover is that mutual silence and mutual healing are two completely different things. Silence is simply the absence of communication. Healing is the process of emotional recovery, self-discovery, growth, and transformation. One can happen without the other. Just because two people are no longer speaking does not mean they are experiencing the same internal reality. In fact, they may be living in completely different emotional worlds while sharing the exact same silence. This is particularly important to understand when a narcissistic dynamic has been involved. In healthy relationships, distance often allows both people to reflect, learn, and gradually process what happened. There is usually a level of accountability, self-awareness, and emotional honesty that supports genuine healing. But narcissistic relationships operate differently. The foundation of the connection is often built on control, validation, emotional dependency, and power imbalances rather than mutual emotional growth. When contact stops, the person who has been hurt is often forced into a difficult but necessary journey. They begin facing emotions they may have avoided for months or even years. They confront the confusion, the disappointment, the broken trust, and the unanswered questions. They start examining patterns that once seemed normal but now appear unhealthy. They begin learning why they tolerated certain behaviors and why they ignored certain warning signs. This process is painful, but it is also where healing begins. The narcissist, however, may experience the silence through an entirely different lens. Instead of focusing on emotional recovery, they may focus on the loss of access, influence, attention, or control. Rather than asking, "How did my behavior affect this person?" they may be asking, "Why am I no longer getting the response I used to get?" The silence may not trigger deep self-reflection. It may simply interrupt a pattern they expected to continue. This difference is why mutual silence should never be mistaken for mutual progress. Many survivors struggle because they secretly assume that if they are hurting, the narcissist must be hurting in the same way. They imagine both people sitting alone, reflecting on memories, recognizing mistakes, and gradually reaching the same conclusions. But emotional experiences are not always mirrored. The fact that two people share a history does not mean they share the same emotional journey afterward. While you may be spending your time rebuilding your confidence, processing your pain, and learning healthier boundaries, the other person may be focused on entirely different concerns. They may not be engaging in the same level of self-examination. They may not be questioning their behavior. They may not even be viewing the situation through the same emotional framework that you are. This realization can initially feel unfair. After all, healing requires effort. It requires honesty. It requires confronting uncomfortable truths. It requires accepting losses and taking responsibility for personal growth. There is a natural desire to believe that everyone involved must eventually go through the same process. But healing is not something that automatically happens because time passes or because communication stops. Some people use silence to grow. Others use silence to wait. Some use it to recover. Others use it to find a new source of attention. The external behavior may look identical, but the internal experience can be dramatically different. Another reason this misunderstanding is so common is because silence creates space for imagination. When there is no communication, the mind naturally tries to fill in the blanks. You may wonder what they are thinking. You may wonder whether they regret what happened. You may wonder whether they finally understand your pain. Without answers, the brain often creates stories to reduce uncertainty. But healing requires letting go of the need to know what is happening on the other side. The truth is that your recovery cannot depend on their emotional state. If they regret everything, your healing still matters. If they regret nothing, your healing still matters. If they miss you, your healing still matters. If they never think about you again, your healing still matters. Their internal experience does not determine your progress. One of the most empowering moments in recovery occurs when you stop measuring your healing against their perceived healing. Instead of asking whether they have changed, you begin asking whether you have changed. Instead of wondering whether they understand your value, you begin recognizing your value yourself. Instead of focusing on whether they have learned a lesson, you focus on the lessons you have learned. This shift changes everything. because the goal was never to make them understand. The goal was never to make them feel what you felt. The goal was never to ensure that both people arrived at the same emotional destination. The goal is your freedom, your peace, your clarity, your ability to move forward without carrying the weight of someone else's choices. Mutual silence can look identical on the surface, but beneath that silence, two completely different stories may be unfolding. One person may be avoiding growth while the other is embracing it. One person may be repeating old patterns while the other is breaking them. One person may be searching for another source of validation while the other is finally learning to validate themselves. That is why silence should never be confused with healing. Healing is not proven by the absence of contact. It is proven by the presence of growth. It is found in stronger boundaries, greater self-respect, deeper self-awareness, and a renewed sense of identity. It is found in the ability to wake up one day and realize that your emotional well-being is no longer connected to another person's actions. And when that happens, the silence is no longer just a lack of communication. It becomes evidence that you have finally begun building a life that does not depend on the person who once had the power to disrupt your peace. One of the most difficult truths to understand after going no contact with a narcissist is that they often do not view silence the same way you do. While you may see no contact as a necessary step toward healing, self-respect, and emotional recovery, the narcissist frequently sees it as something entirely different. In many cases, they view it as a temporary phase, a pause in the cycle, or even a challenge that they expect to win. This is why so many narcissists assume that eventually, sooner or later, you will be the one who breaks the silence first. This expectation is not always based on confidence, it is often based on history. If a narcissistic relationship lasted for any significant period of time, a pattern was usually created. There may have been arguments, breakups, periods of distance, emotional withdrawal, or moments when one of you walked away. But despite the conflicts, communication often resumed. The cycle repeated itself again and again. Every time the relationship appeared to be ending, somehow it found its way back to familiar territory. Over time, this repetition teaches the narcissist something powerful. It teaches them that separation is temporary. They begin to believe that no matter how frustrated, hurt, or exhausted you become, eventually your emotions will bring you back. They may assume that loneliness will weaken your resolve. They may assume that your empathy will cause you to give another chance. They may assume that your need for answers will push you to reach out. Whatever the reason, they often develop an expectation that the silence will not last. This expectation becomes especially strong when the narcissist has successfully pulled you back into the relationship before. Every previous reconciliation becomes evidence in their mind that they still have influence. Every time you returned after being hurt, every time you accepted an apology, every time you gave them another opportunity, the belief grew stronger that the pattern would continue indefinitely. What they frequently fail to recognize is that people change. A person can tolerate disappointment for a long time. A person can forgive repeatedly. A person can continue hoping that things will improve. But eventually there comes a point where the emotional cost becomes too high. There comes a moment when exhaustion replaces hope, when clarity replaces confusion, when self-respect becomes stronger than attachment. The narcissist often struggles to recognize this shift because they are relying on an outdated version of you. They are relying on the person who stayed, the person who explained, the person who chased closure, the person who kept trying to fix something that could not be fixed alone. In their mind, that version of you still exists. That is why silence may not concern them at first. In the beginning, they may assume you are simply taking time to cool off. They may believe you are waiting for them to make a move. They may expect you to reach out after a few days, a few weeks, or even a few months. They may continue living as though the connection remains available whenever they choose to reactivate it. What they do not always anticipate is consistency. Many people can go silent for a short period. Few people maintain firm boundaries when emotions become intense. The narcissist often counts on this reality. They understand that withdrawal creates discomfort. They understand that memories can become stronger during periods of loneliness. They understand that uncertainty often tempts people to seek answers. Because of this, they may simply wait. They may assume that time itself will weaken your determination. But something unexpected happens when genuine healing begins. Instead of becoming weaker, your boundaries become stronger. Instead of feeling more dependent, you become more independent. Instead of needing contact, you become comfortable without it. The longer you maintain no contact, the more evidence you gather that your life can continue without their presence. You begin discovering that peace is possible. You begin noticing that your emotional state is stabilizing. You begin reclaiming energy that was once consumed by anxiety overthinking, and emotional turbulence. And this is where the narcissist's expectation starts colliding with reality. The timeline they imagined no longer works. The response they expected never arrives. The cycle they relied upon begins breaking apart. For someone accustomed to maintaining influence, this can feel deeply unsettling. Not necessarily because they miss the relationship itself, but because the predictable structure has disappeared. The person who always returned is no longer returning. The person who always responded is no longer responding. The person who once provided emotional access is no longer available. This creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is uncomfortable for anyone who depends on control. What makes this situation even more significant is that your silence communicates something words never could. Arguments can be dismissed, boundaries can be challenged, explanations can be debated, but sustained silence sends a message that cannot easily be argued with. It demonstrates that your actions now match your decisions. It shows that your priorities have changed. It reveals that your attention is no longer centered on maintaining the connection. Many narcissists spend years believing that emotional bonds guarantee future access. They assume that shared history creates permanent influence. They assume that strong feelings make complete separation impossible. But when you refuse to break no contact, you challenge those assumptions. You demonstrate that love is not enough to justify unhealthy treatment. You demonstrate that attachment is not stronger than self-respect. You demonstrate that history does not obligate you to remain trapped in old patterns. This can be difficult for the narcissist to comprehend because it contradicts the expectations they built over time. They expected another opportunity, another conversation, another opening, another cycle. Instead, they encounter something unfamiliar, a boundary that remains intact, a silence that continues, a person who is no longer behaving according to old expectations. That is why many survivors are surprised when the real emotional shift does not happen immediately. It often unfolds gradually. Day by day, the narcissist's confidence in the old pattern weakens while your confidence in your new life grows stronger. The distance becomes more real. The separation becomes more permanent. The familiar cycle loses its power. What once seemed impossible becomes normal. What once felt unbearable becomes manageable. What once felt like a temporary decision becomes a lasting transformation. And the longer this continues, the more obvious it becomes that no contact was never just about creating distance from another person. It was about creating space for a new version of yourself to emerge, one that no longer measures worth through someone else's attention, no longer sacrifices peace for temporary connection, and no longer mistakes repeated cycles for genuine love. One of the most surprising realities people encounter after going no contact with a narcissist is discovering that the real shock is not the silence itself. The real shock comes from something much deeper. It comes from the loss of control. Many people assume that if a narcissist becomes upset by no contact, it must mean they are heartbroken, grieving the relationship, or desperately missing the person who left. While emotions can certainly be involved, the issue is often far more complex. In many narcissistic dynamics, the relationship is not simply about connection. It is also about influence. It is about access. It is about knowing that they can affect your thoughts, emotions, decisions, and reactions whenever they choose. When that ability suddenly disappears, a completely different experience begins to unfold. Control does not always look obvious. In fact, some of the most powerful forms of control are subtle. It may be knowing that a text message can instantly change your mood. It may be knowing that a compliment can pull you closer. It may be knowing that criticism can make you question yourself. It may be knowing that silence can trigger anxiety and that attention can create relief. Over time, the narcissist learns which emotional buttons produce specific reactions. This does not necessarily happen overnight. It develops gradually through repeated interactions. Every time you explain yourself excessively, every time you chase clarity, every time you seek reassurance, every time you react emotionally to their behavior, information is being gathered, patterns are being established, expectations are being formed. Eventually, the narcissist begins feeling confident that they understand how to influence the emotional atmosphere of the relationship. They know when to pull away, they know when to return, they know when to offer hope, they know when to create uncertainty, and because these patterns have worked before, they often assume they will continue working in the future. This is why no contact can become such a profound disruption. When you stop responding, the familiar system stops functioning. The reactions they once relied upon no longer arrive. The emotional feedback they once received disappears. The influence they once exercised becomes unreliable. For someone who has grown accustomed to controlling the rhythm of the relationship, this can be deeply unsettling. Imagine someone using a remote control for years and suddenly discovering that the device no longer responds. They press the same buttons, they expect the same outcome, but nothing happens. That uncertainty creates discomfort, not because the buttons changed, but because the control is gone. This is often what makes no contact so powerful. You are not simply removing communication, you are removing access to your emotional world. You are no longer providing immediate reactions. You are no longer participating in the familiar cycle. You are no longer reinforcing the belief that your attention is always available. At first, the narcissist may not fully understand what is happening. They may assume the silence is temporary. They may believe you are waiting for them to make the next move. They may expect you to become overwhelmed by emotions and eventually reach out. Because that expectation exists, they often remain confident during the early stages of separation. But as time passes, confidence can begin turning into uncertainty. Days become weeks, weeks become months. The silence continues. The expected response never arrives. The familiar pattern refuses to restart. And that is when the deeper realization begins. The person they thought they understood is changing. The emotional predictability they relied upon is disappearing. The influence they once considered secure is weakening. This can be shocking because many narcissists become accustomed to viewing relationships through the lens of accessibility. They assume that certain people will always remain emotionally available. They assume that shared history guarantees future access. They assume that emotional bonds create permanent influence. But no contact challenges all of those assumptions. It introduces a reality they may not have anticipated, a reality where you are making decisions without consulting them, a reality where you are healing without their involvement, a reality where your emotions are no longer organized around their behavior. This shift can feel incredibly threatening to someone who depends on control for validation and security. What makes the situation even more significant is that control often becomes visible only after it is lost. During the relationship, many people focus on specific incidents, the arguments, the manipulation, the criticism, the confusion, the mixed signals, the emotional highs and lows. But after no contact begins, a larger pattern starts emerging. You begin noticing how much of your energy was dedicated to managing someone else's reactions. You begin noticing how often your decisions were influenced by fear, guilt, obligation, or hope. You begin recognizing that your emotional state was frequently determined by someone else's behavior. And as this awareness grows, something remarkable happens. You start reclaiming ownership of your own life. Your moods become less dependent on their actions. Your confidence becomes less dependent on their approval. Your decisions become less dependent on their opinions. Your future becomes less dependent on their participation. The more independent you become, the less control anyone can exercise over you. This transformation creates one of the greatest shocks of all, not only for the narcissist, but often for you as well, because many survivors underestimate how much power they have already reclaimed. They spend so much time focusing on what was lost that they fail to recognize what has been gained. Clarity, freedom, emotional stability, self-trust, peace. These qualities often emerge gradually. They develop quietly, they strengthen with consistency, and every day that passes without returning to the old cycle reinforces them further. Meanwhile, the narcissist may find themselves confronting something unfamiliar, the reality that influence cannot be maintained without participation, control cannot survive without access, manipulation cannot function without engagement. The old strategies lose effectiveness when the other person stops playing the role they were expected to play. That is why the loss of control often creates such a powerful shock. It forces a confrontation with reality, the reality that another human being has the right to establish boundaries, the reality that access is not an entitlement, the reality that attention is not guaranteed, the reality that emotional independence changes everything. And perhaps the most significant part of all is that this shift rarely happens through dramatic confrontation. It does not require winning an argument. It does not require proving a point. It does not require convincing anyone that they were wrong. It happens quietly through consistent action, through choosing peace over chaos, through choosing self-respect over familiar pain, through choosing growth over repetition. And with every day that those choices continue, the control that once seemed so powerful becomes weaker, while the freedom that once seemed impossible becomes stronger. One of the most transformative aspects of no contact is that silence has a unique way of revealing truths that were once hidden beneath noise, confusion, and emotional chaos. When communication with a narcissist finally stops, many people expect the greatest challenge to be the absence of the relationship. What they often do not expect is the clarity that begins to emerge. At first, the silence can feel uncomfortable. It can feel empty. It can feel as though something important is missing. But over time, that same silence starts exposing realities that were difficult to see while the relationship was active. When you are deeply involved in a narcissistic dynamic, your attention is often consumed by immediate problems. You are focused on the latest argument, the latest misunderstanding, the latest disappointment, or the latest attempt to repair what has gone wrong. Your emotional energy becomes concentrated on surviving each moment as it arrives. Because of this, you rarely have enough distance to see the entire pattern. It is similar to standing inches away from a massive painting. When you are too close, you can only see small sections. You notice individual colors and shapes, but the larger image remains hidden. Only when you step back can you finally see what was there all along. Silence creates that distance. Without constant texts, calls, explanations, accusations, promises, or emotional reactions, your mind begins slowing down. The urgency that once dominated your thinking starts fading. The pressure to constantly respond, analyze, defend yourself, or anticipate the next emotional shift gradually decreases. For the first time in a long time, your thoughts are no longer competing with someone else's influence. This is when the truth begins surfacing. Many survivors discover that they spent years explaining away behavior that should never have required explanation. They justified broken promises because they wanted to believe things would improve. They minimized disrespect because they were focused on preserving the relationship. They ignored warning signs because acknowledging them would have required painful decisions. They gave the benefit of the doubt repeatedly because hope often felt easier than acceptance. While inside the relationship, these justifications can seem reasonable, outside the relationship, they often look very different. Silence removes the constant stream of new information that kept resetting your perspective. During the relationship, every hurtful experience may have been followed by a kind gesture. Every disappointment may have been followed by an apology. Every moment of doubt may have been followed by reassurance. These alternating experiences created confusion because they prevented you from fully processing what was happening. The good moments interrupted the bad moments. The promises interrupted the reality. The hope interrupted the evidence. As a result, you remained emotionally invested in what could happen rather than what was actually happening. But once silence begins, there are no new promises to distract you, no new explanations to analyze, no new emotional highs to balance out the lows. All that remains is the accumulated evidence of the relationship itself. And evidence has a way of becoming much clearer when emotions stop constantly competing for attention. This clarity can initially be painful. You may begin recognizing how often your needs were ignored. You may realize how frequently your feelings were dismissed. You may notice patterns of manipulation that once felt normal. You may see how much effort you invested compared to what you received in return. You may recognize that many of the problems you blamed on yourself were never yours to carry. These realizations are not always comfortable. In fact, they can be heartbreaking because with clarity comes grief. You are no longer grieving only the relationship. You are grieving the reality of the relationship. You are grieving the version of the relationship you hoped existed. You are grieving the future you imagined. You are grieving the effort you invested. You are grieving the years spent trying to earn something that should have been given freely. Yet this grief serves an important purpose. It replaces illusion with truth. And while illusions can feel comforting, they rarely lead to freedom. Truth, on the other hand, creates the possibility of genuine healing. Another powerful aspect of silence is that it reveals truths about yourself as well. Many people enter no contact believing they have lost something essential. They believe they have lost their source of love, their source of validation, their source of happiness, their source of emotional security. But as time passes, they begin making an unexpected discovery. They start functioning without the person they believed they could not live without. They start making decisions independently. They start solving problems on their own. They start experiencing moments of joy that have nothing to do with the relationship. They start reconnecting with interests, goals, friendships, and dreams that were neglected for years. The silence reveals a truth that was hidden beneath dependency. You were always stronger than you thought. The relationship may have convinced you otherwise. The constant criticism may have convinced you otherwise. The emotional instability may have convinced you otherwise. But the evidence begins telling a different story. Every day you continue moving forward becomes proof of your resilience. Every challenge you overcome becomes proof of your capability. Every peaceful moment becomes proof that your well-being does not depend on another person's approval. Silence also reveals the difference between attachment and love. Many people confuse the two because both create powerful emotions. Attachment often thrives on fear. Fear of losing someone, fear of being alone, fear of uncertainty, fear of letting go. Love, however, is not sustained by fear. Love respects boundaries. Love supports growth. Love creates safety rather than confusion. Love encourages authenticity rather than control. Once the noise of the relationship disappears, you begin examining what truly existed beneath the emotional intensity. And that examination often reveals realities that were impossible to recognize while actively participating in the cycle. Perhaps the most important truth silence reveals is that peace has value. During toxic relationships, chaos often becomes normalized. Stress becomes routine. Anxiety becomes familiar. Emotional unpredictability becomes expected. You become so accustomed to instability that you forget what stability feels like. Then silence arrives. At first it feels strange, then it feels quiet, then it feels calming, then it begins feeling safe, and eventually you realize something remarkable. The absence of chaos is not emptiness, it is peace. The absence of manipulation is not loneliness, it is freedom. The absence of constant emotional turbulence is not boredom, it is stability. These truths often remain hidden while communication continues because every new interaction pulls attention back into the cycle. But when silence remains long enough, the cycle loses its ability to distort reality. The confusion starts clearing. The contradictions become easier to recognize. The excuses become harder to justify. The patterns become impossible to ignore. And what emerges from that clarity is not merely a better understanding of the relationship. It is a deeper understanding of yourself, your worth, your needs, your boundaries, and the kind of life you want to build moving forward.